to congratulate Jairus Eichenberry on his delightful variations on chopsticks that he played earlier today. I think most of us we were ready to get up and start dancing around at the front end here. It's great. As you know, our originally scheduled speaker was not able to make it today, and we are delighted to have an outstanding replacement today to speak to us about the issue of birds and aircraft trying to occupy the same space. A very challenging situation. This week, of course, we're all aware of the horrific crash over in France, which appears to have been caused by the co-pilot's deliberate action, and terrible thing. Birds, there are many more birds up in the skies than there are erratic pilots, and it's something we need to be aware of. Our speaker today is Dr. Esteban Fernandez-Juricic. He is a professor of biological sciences at Purdue. He did his undergraduate work in Argentina. He got his PhD in Madrid, Spain. He did his first postdoc at Oxford College in England, a man of the world. He did his second postdoc work at the University of Minnesota. After that, he spent 6 years as an assistant professor at University of California, Long Beach. And 7 years ago, Purdue was lucky enough to snare him in our College of Science. And it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Dr. Esteban Fernandez-Juricic, and he is going to enlighten us all about problems up in the sky.
Thank you.
You can have a microphone if you'd like.
Can you hear me? I usually speak at... No? Okay, I'll use the microphone. Right, perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. And today I'm going to be talking about a problem, but not necessarily about a final solution. So we're thinking about how to deal with the problem, but we don't have the final beautiful results that we all wish. So the issue has to do with birds and aircraft, right? And if we start thinking about airfields, from a bird's point of view, they're wonderful areas for them to hang out, to breed, and to feed, because there are not very humans walking around, so the levels of human disturbance are quite low. At the same time, birds fly, aircraft fly, so there is sort of a competition for space, not only in the air, but also on the ground, as you can see in the picture. So there have been a lot of bird strikes, and there are some bird strikes that are not a big deal, but other bird strikes that have been a big deal, including human lives lost. About 250 humans have perished, unfortunately, as a result of these bird strikes in the last 30 years or so. The other issue is that bird strikes cause mortality to the birds, and some bird species are endangered or threatened, which raises a lot of other concerns. And from the perspective of the airline industry, they're very costly, right? So this is a problem, and when I go around talking about bird strikes, people look at me like, well, is this such a big deal? So I have a video to share with you to show you sort of the big deal this could be. So this is a video from a training aircraft. It's a Canadian training aircraft. They're trying to take off, and at the moment of takeoff, you will see a dog, which is a duck, coming into and hitting the engine on the aircraft, and then you will see what happens afterwards. Let's see if the sound... No, sorry about that. Okay, so let me see if I can do... the aircraft doesn't have an engine functioning right now.
Just try to get a relay going. Okay. Get her from the front. Fly the plane.
So one of the pilots is trying to maneuver the aircraft to an area without humans, and the other pilot is trying to restart the engine, but it's not working.
Okay, you go. See your engine. T6. You're in. Ready. Okay. And I get you ejected to the north. We have an engine failure. Okay, prepare to back aircraft. Eject. Got you. Copy your brake out to the north.
Right. Yes, the ejection, yes. So this is one of the consequences of burst strikes, right? So we lose aircraft. The good news about this story is that both pilots survived and they're well and healthy and all that. But burst strikes have that capacity to lose aircraft, which is a lot of money, and potentially to lose human lives. So there are two layers in this problematic of burst strike. One layer has to do with the airport, right? So we have at airports a bunch of different management strategies right now underway, and the different ways that we can minimize the abundance of birds within the airfield, right? Even train dogs that go and scare birds. And all these measurements have been relatively successful. So this is a number of bird strikes at less than 500 feet, and as you can see over the years, that number is slightly going down because of all these efforts. However, one of the problems that we have right now is what protects the aircraft when the aircraft is outside of the airport property. And this is a big deal because if we plot the number of damaging bird strikes above 500 feet, as you can see over the years, they have been increasing. So that's one of the most important issues. Probably you may have heard in the news a few years ago, in January 2009, the crash landing of these aircraft coming out of LaGuardia. And the problem with that is that any kind of management strategy within the airport could not have made any difference in this crash landing. And the reason is because these aircraft hit a flock of geese, right? And unfortunately, the geese hit both engines at the same time. So one of the questions I get all the time is, well, but I heard in the news that when these manufacturers build the engines, they run tests and make sure that the engines are strong enough to withstand the impact of a bird. Yes, you're absolutely correct. However, the engines are not strong enough to withstand the impact of a bird like this size, like a Canada goose, right? So see, here is one of the tests. I don't know if the video is working. We're not having a good time with the videos. Okay, great. Right. So this is they're about to test the engine with a frozen bird, the size more or less of Canada goose, right? And you will see what happens with the engine. So this flight got 2 Canada geese in one engine and 1 Canada goose in the other engine. And if you don't have engines, it's very difficult to stay up, right? So that's why it crash landed, basically, right? Fortunately, all the passengers survived, so that's another good story. The problem is that as the incidence of flights and as the abundance of birds increases over time, the chances of having a high frequency of bird strikes, particularly the damaging one, are unfortunately potentially can increase, right? So if we look at this picture, you will see that what we're concerned about is what happens above 500 feet, right here. Below 500 feet, we have all the management measures to deal with that. But what happens here? And hopefully you're noticing that there is a higher number of bird strikes at night than during the day. So then some people started thinking about these and started thinking about maybe there are ways that we can make the aircraft more visible. And if we can make the aircraft more visible, maybe we can reduce the frequency of bird strikes. So one way of doing that is by using lights that might potentially scare birds off, right? Now, the problem with these slides, oops, I do apologize. I don't know what's going on today here. There we go. Okay. So the problem with these these lights, the aircraft lights, is the fact that the way birds see things is fundamentally different from the way we see things. Okay, and the current aircraft lighting that we have available in the aircraft, like the landing lights, are not tuned to the bird visual system. So let me tell you briefly what I mean by vision that is fundamentally different. So here we have an example of a hawk, one of those days. Right. So hopefully, okay, not a bit. Oh yeah, here, great. So this is a hawk, and the hawk has a crater cam, right? And you can see that the animal has to fly around and avoid crashing into the trees, right? So if we were to do the same thing as humans, I promise you we would be crashing into every single tree, or almost. The reason they don't crash into trees is because they have high temporal visual resolution. That means that their retinas can process visual stimuli much, much faster than we can process visual stimuli, okay? So for instance, if we bring the animal into a room with a fluorescent light, right? As you know, for us, the fluorescent light is steady, but for the bird, the fluorescent light will be flickering because they can perceive that higher visual resolution. Birds also have lateral vision because their eyes are laterally placed, besides their binocular vision. They have high visual acuity because the relative size of their eyes compared to the body mass is much higher. They have more visual pigments than humans have. So humans usually have 3 types of visual pigments, and that's why we can perceive things in color. But birds usually have 4 types of visual pigments. So they can see colors that we cannot even imagine that they exist. They also have in their photoreceptors some organelles called oil droplets. Here is the visual pigment, here is the oil droplet. And these oil droplets act as sunglasses. They filter light, and the way this helps in their vision is that enhance their ability to distinguish between colors. So if we bring here 2 reds, right, that for us are pretty much the same, for a bird, most likely they will be different because they can use these oil droplets. So birds see in ways that we cannot even imagine, and they're very different from the way we see. So here is a simulation that we did with a program. So this is the way a human would be perceiving these white balls, and this is the way this particular bird species would be perceiving these white balls. This doesn't mean that the bird will see this color necessarily, but the point of this simulation is to show you that the way we see some colors are fundamentally different from the way they see colors. So the implication is that if we bring a light that for us is blue or white or whatever, for a bird it's not going to be the same. It's going to be fundamentally different. So what we're trying to do is to develop some stimuli tuned to their visual system, and as a result of that, try to enhance the behavioral response. So as an example of this, imagine that we have our usual light. So we're driving, we see red, we stop, right? But imagine that we do the same thing with individuals that cannot see any color. They cannot distinguish color. Well, the outcome is going to be an unsuccessful outcome. So what we're trying to do again is to use what we call applied sensory ecology to develop these lights tuned to the visual systems of birds. So that's the bottom line. Okay, so we have an aircraft, we have a bird. They are on a collision course, right? And as they approach each other, there are different things that happen in relation to the bird. So at some point, the bird detects the aircraft. After detecting the aircraft, the bird turns its visual attention to the aircraft, and then the animal begins a response, and eventually it tries to engage in some kind of avoidance behavior. If the avoidance behavior is successful, It doesn't go into the news, nothing happens. But if the avoidance behavior is not successful, we have a bird strike. So what we're trying to do with the lights is to increase or enhance detection and enhance visual attention so that we can give the animal a few more seconds to try to engage into the avoidance response and miss the collision with the aircraft. That's basically the gist of our research project here. Okay, so I need to give you a few concepts that are a little bit technical, but bear with me for a few minutes. So imagine that we have different dimensions, right? Here we have color vision, here we have temporal visual resolution, and here we have spatial visual resolution. So in these dimensions, we can plot what we call the avian visual sensory space, which will occupy different parts of this visual sensory space. And then we can also plot there the human visual sensory space. So hopefully you're realizing that, oh, okay, so we humans, even though we're visually guided, we're not as good as birds. And that's true. Okay? Okay, so the next thing is that red space. That red space represents sort of the proportion of the sensory space that is stimulated with the current aircraft lighting, like the landing lights that aircraft have. So as you can see as well is, oh, okay, well, we're not necessarily using a bunch of the available visual sensory space. And that's where we come in. So because what we're trying to do is to find out where these, what we call visual sweet spots in the avian visual system might be. And those visual sweet spots might be overlapping with our visual sensory system, or they might be outside of our sensory system. And if they're outside, actually that might be a good thing, because then we can expose the animals to stimuli that we are not going to see, and that's good because it's not going to disturb our visual system. So that's what we're trying to do with the research that we do in my lab. So this is the overall research approach. Unfortunately, you cannot see what is here, but basically it's a multidisciplinary project that involves learning some aspects on the visual physiology of birds. So here are a bunch of things that we study with different visual physiology techniques. Oh, thank you very much. That's okay. So we quantify these visual sensory dimensions in order to understand the visual system in birds. Then what we do is we use some modeling approaches. It's called perceptual modeling. That's pretty good. It's called perceptual modeling, right? And basically what we do is we take the visual physiology information and we put that information in these perceptual models, as we call them. And I'm going to try to explain them very simply for you with the use of these. So these perceptual models, basically what they do is they get an estimate of how much a light might stand out from the visual background. And the reason we need these models is because, as I told you before, birds see colors that we cannot even imagine. Right? So we have to quantify, not in terms of what colors they see, but in terms of how much a particular stimulus stands out from the background, whatever that background is. Okay? So we get an estimate of what we call, actually, for these, that'd be great. We get an estimate of what we call chromatic or achromatic contrast. So the object is the circle and the background is the square. So you can see that this will have a low value of chromatic contrast, it will have a high value of chromatic contrast. And we do the same with achromatic contrast, right? And this is a very complex model. I'm not going to go into the details, but the point here is that the model takes into consideration a bunch of components from the visual physiology of birds, right? So then what we do is we do this modeling approach in which we have the color space of birds, and each of these vertices represents the different types of photoreceptors of birds. We have the object and we have the background, and we calculate that distance. That distance is the visual contrast value. Okay? So what we're trying to do is to enhance or increase the distance between the object and the background. Because what that will do is will increase the saliency or the conspicuousness of the light. That's what we're trying to do. So once we do that, let me go back quickly. Once we do that, we we sort of narrow down a few different lights, and then with those lights, what we do is we run behavioral experiments in which we measure visual attention, detection time, and escape time of the burst to see whether the lights are successful or not in terms of enhancing the avoidance response. Okay? So, right. So let me tell you a couple of examples of these research approaches that we have been doing that have shown very interesting results. So we used a radio control aircraft, and what we did is we had the aircraft, we measured a bunch of properties of the aircraft, irradiance, reflectance of the aircraft, reflectance of the lights with a spectrometer, and then we took the Canada goose as a study species because, as I showed you before, Canada geese can cause very damaging strikes. So we measured the density of different types of photoreceptors, the sensitivity of the visual pigments, and the oil droplets I mentioned to you before. And with that, all that information, we put that in a chromatic contrast calculation. So here you have the chromatic contrast of the aircraft without the lights in blue, and the aircraft with the lights in red, in two environmental conditions, a clear sky and a partly cloudy sky. And basically what the results of this modeling approach are saying is that from the perspective of the Canada goose, an aircraft with lights on would be more conspicuous than an aircraft with the lights off. Okay, that's great. Let's go and test this behavior. So what we did is we took the same radio-controlled aircraft and we fitted the aircraft with these experimental lights. These are lights available from any kind of company that sells lights for aircraft. And what we did is we approached the aircraft, we approached these geese with the aircraft and the lights were on or off, right? So here's a video, a couple of videos showing you that. So here's the aircraft approaching, and here are the geese responding to the aircraft. Basically, the take-home of these results is that when the lights were on, the geese reacted to the aircraft about 4 seconds earlier than when the lights were off. That's great news. Some of you might be thinking, really? All this for 4 seconds? Come on. Well, actually, if you think about these, 4 seconds at the speeds at which these events take place is an eternity. It's a lot of time for the animal to start engaging in this escape behavior. So that was very, very encouraging. So then what we decided to do is to say, well, though this experiment was done with these lights that are commercially available, can we start developing lights that are going to be tuned to the eyes of the birds? So we did all the visual physiology work that I mentioned to you before, in this case for brown-headed cowbirds, and then we reverse engineered these perceptual models, and we estimated the lights that would be, LED lights, that would be more conspicuous to the visual system of the brown-headed cowbirds, and we found out that those lights were about 470 nanometers, right? So we used these very nice LED lights. So we did a series of experiments. Here's one of them, in which we had the aircraft, and you see the lights on right there, right? And some meters away from the aircraft, we had these brown-headed cowbirds, and what we measured is their detection time. In situations in which the lights were off, the lights were steady, and the lights were pulsing. The bottom line here is that we, with the lights tuned to the brown-headed cowbird visual system, instead of 4 seconds, we gained 10 seconds. So these are lights that are not for humans, these are lights that are for brown-headed cowbirds. And with those lights, we enhance the response of these animals. Okay. Hopefully, some of you are thinking, well, there is a gap here. And the gap is that this is wonderful, this is a wonderful result, but the aircraft is static. What are you talking about? Aircraft move at really, really high speeds. So what we started doing is trying to understand what happens when vehicles move at high speeds. Can birds detect the vehicles and escape accordingly? So we did an experiment without any kind of lights. And in this particular case, we used a virtual arena, right, in which we have the birds, and then we, let's see if it works, yes. We had a video with a track approaching the animals. So what we manipulated is the speed at which the track would approach the animals. So we were trying to see whether the time to collision, so whether the animals would be able to maintain a time to collision enough for them to escape successfully, or that time to collision would be reduced at very high speeds. And that's exactly what we found, that at really high speeds, birds were ineffective at detecting the incoming vehicle, and as a result, they died. Of course, they didn't die because everything was virtual, right? But they didn't have enough time to escape from that vehicle approach. So that led us to start thinking about these lights fitted to the aircraft. So what we did is we repeated the experiment with a static aircraft, but in this particular case, the aircraft was approaching the animal. So we had the lights off, and this is the result. I don't need to go into the details, but basically this is the speed effect that I was telling you before. At really high speeds, the animals had more difficult time detecting the aircraft, right? But then we showed the animals the lights tuned to their visual systems, but the lights were pulsing. And we have the same speed effect as shown before, but the strength of that speed effect got reduced. But the surprise came when the lights were steady. When the lights were steady, the speed effect went away. So the implication here is that these lights tuned to the cowbird visual system might reduce the speed effect, might minimize this effect of speed, and might enhance the detection of these animals. So one of the things that we were struggling with, and reviewers were telling us all the time, is the fact that, well, how do you know that the animals are paying attention to the lights? So the animals have these really fast vehicle, it could be a truck, it could be an aircraft, whatever we were using in the experiments, approaching to them. I really don't believe that they're really paying attention to the lights, right, which are a component of that vehicle. So this is a very difficult question to tackle because we will need to measure visual attention. You know, how are you paying attention to the lights? So we can try to measure visual attention with humans because we go and say, hey, were you paying attention to the lights before you you saw the vehicle right next to you or not? And then the user will say yes or no. But how do we do that with a bird? So what we decided to do is to develop what we call an eye tracker for birds. Are you aware of eye trackers for humans? Any of you? Good. So eye trackers for humans are usually used in advertisement, right? So the way in which this works is you have a camera, right, that is looking at your eyes, right, and a camera that is looking at whatever you're looking, right? So if you go to the grocery store, right, and you're trying to buy whatever, dish detergent, right? So then you start looking at different options, and what this system does is it determines where your center of visual attention is paying attention to. Are you paying attention to the pictures in the different things, or are you paying attention to the shape, or what are you paying attention? So we decided to develop the same thing for birds, and basically what it does is it looks at the eye, and then we show the animal videos of these vehicles approaching the animal. So here's a video. So what you see here in red is the center of visual attention. So you can see the animal sort of paying attention there. Can you see anything? But suddenly, there you go. So you have a vehicle that was approaching the animal with the lights on steady. So, and the most interesting thing about this is that the animal paid attention to that before even we noticed there was something there, right? Which shows, you know, the wonderful visual capabilities that they have. So we have just finished developing this new tool, and we are using this new tool to try to ask questions about, well, are they paying attention to the lights when the lights are in certain parts of the aircraft, or they are in other parts of the aircraft? How can we enhance this aircraft light effect on the birds? Okay, so to summarize, here is a sort of a big picture view of the visual system components that we're measuring and how those components are going to influence the design of these new lights that we're trying to develop. So we're measuring the visual field configuration, which will allow us to manipulate the light viewing angle of the lights. we're measuring the sensitivity and density of these different photoreceptors, and we're using perceptual modeling that will allow us to choose a light color that will be conspicuous in different ambient light conditions. And we're also measuring with these visual attention gizmos and a few other things that I didn't have the time to talk about, the light pulsing rate. Are certain light pulsing rates that will draw more attention from the animals than others, so we'll be able to manipulate that too. So the take home is that tuning the lights to the avian visual sweet spot can make aircraft lighting an integral strategy to reduce these bird-aircraft collisions. So I've shown you that aircraft lighting can change the behavior of birds, and that's one of the things that we have been working. But the next step in our project is to start thinking about what happens with the airport LED lights, right? So the idea here is that if we can also use these LED lights to manipulate the behavior of the bird, then we can have some kind of synergistic effects by which we can further reduce the frequency of bird strikes. So the way we see these is that we will have the aircraft with the lights and the runway lights. And the idea is that both types of lights talk to each other depending on what type of birds are close to the airport, right? So the idea is that if we flash the lights, right, then the animals might fly away in response of those lights, or the animal might enhance its attention, right, and then try to see the aircraft that is approaching the runway and then fly away. So what we were trying to do, again, is trying to bring these two pieces together, make them talk, and hopefully reduce the frequency of bird strikes. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, my funding sources, and if you have questions, I'll be happy to address them.
That is an absolutely fascinating project. I was totally unaware of the research going on here, and I think it gives us all a great deal to think about. We have time for a couple of questions. Jack?
Why don't you just put some chicken wire in front of that engine so that the bird can't get into the working parts?
No, I'm sorry, I was good. Oh, boy. So people have tried doing that already. The issue with that is that it reduces the performance of the engine quite substantially. So that's why.
Anyone else?
No.
Camilla?
Engineers have tried that, yeah.
There's no way to use sound?
Great question. Okay, so I have a colleague in Ireland who has been studying for years the effects of sound at airports on bird behavior, right? So his goal was to try to develop the same thing that we're doing with the lights, but with different types of sound. And we talk regularly, and it's a fascinating character, right? So when I asked him for the first time, so what do you think? Can we use sound? His answer was, I think the birds that live at airports are deaf. And I think the reason he said that, and he explained that to me afterwards, is that his results have been very ambiguous. So in some cases, he was able to have a lot of success, but then when he repeated the same experiment again, there was nothing. So apparently there is something going on with the sound that birds, they might be, I don't think they're deaf, but maybe their ability to hear is not as good, or basically they don't pay attention to the sounds anymore because they're habituated to those high frequency sounds all the time. Yes?
Could you use light to scare deer away from cold?
A colleague of mine is working on that at the USDA because, as you know, it's a really big deal, right? So he has made a lot of progress, but one of the reasons he's not making more progress is because of lack of funding. And that's a prevalent issue, right? So who can fund work to reduce the collisions with deer, right? From our perspective, you would think, oh, everybody would be interested in doing that. Well, actually, there is no funding to do that. He even got to some insurance companies to try to say, hey, this will save you tons of money. I don't care. Yeah. So I think it's one of the struggles that many scientists have these days to try to find funding sources, even though the questions are very, very important and applicable. It's very challenging these days to find funding.
Is this been tried with wind turbines?
Great. So we're working on that right now. Again, it goes back to funding. So it's a long story. I'm trying to make it short. Duke Energy was fined last year or 2 years ago, I think a few $1 million because the federal government found out that golden eagles died as a result of collisions with wind turbines. Right? So as a result of that, Duke Energy has been trying to get some kind of research done without investing a lot of money to try to minimize these collisions because they don't want to be fined again. So I have to tell Kim this story because it's a good story. So they contacted some engineers. So these engineers said, oh, well, birds see in the ultraviolet range of the spectrum. Let's develop these UV lights that we can have in the wind turbines so that birds will see the wind turbines from far away because they can see in the UV. Then they're going to avoid that. So they tried that. They put some money into that. They tried that. And then they contacted me. And they said, well, we have been trying these UV lights, and I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? So my first question is, well, not all birds can see in the UV. Some species can, some species cannot. So how do you know that golden eagles can see in the UV? So the engineer responded to me, because it's published. It's everywhere. Oh, okay. So I hung up, and the first thing I did is I went to Web of Science and and tried to find a reference showing that golden eagles see in the UV, and I couldn't find it. I contacted a colleague of mine in England saying, hey, I might be missing a reference here, help me out. And he's like, no, nobody has ever shown that all golden eagles can see in the UV. I was like, this is weird. So at the same time, sorry about the long story, but it's good. At the same time, a colleague of mine in another department here at Purdue was doing the genome sequencing of golden eagles, the first genome sequencing of golden eagles. So I went to his office and said, hey, could you go and check for the sequences, the gene sequences that code for the opsins of the visual pigments to see whether they have an ultraviolet sensitive visual system or not. So he went, checked with his data, and they don't. So I called Duke and I said, I'm so sorry, but I've just found out, and it is about to be published, that golden eagles cannot see in the UV. So the Duke person said, oh, that might explain the results we have been getting. So the bottom line here is that people go and say, oh, it's simple, let's try that. And they're investing tons of money into doing that, but it's a waste of money because they're not thinking about how these other species might be perceiving things. So they're developing stimuli based on the human visual system or based on some anecdote about how all birds are supposed to perceive, and that's not necessarily the case.
Fascinating. We'd like to give you a little remembrance of your presentation today, and it's actually very appropriate because it's a...
Oh, there you go.
So if you see any Kiwanis birds floating around...
There you go. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
His presentation reminds me of a story a number of years ago when 4-engine jets were the common mode of transportation across the country. And a first-time flyer on one of these flights, midway into the flight, the plane runs into a bird and one of the engines goes out, and the pilot comes over to the PA and says, well, we've lost one of our engines, so we're going to continue on, but we'll be 15 minutes late getting into our destination. A little while later, they hit another bird, and the second engine goes out, And the pilot comes on and says, well, we're still fine. Well, we've got enough power and everything, but we will be 40 minutes late getting to our destination. 15 minutes later, they run into another bird, probably a goose, knocks the third engine out, and the pilot says, well, we're going to continue on, but we will be an hour and 10 minutes late. And at that point, this first-time flyer leans over to his seatmate and says, if we lose one more engine, we're going to be up here all night.